Thank you to Rev Rodney, who prepared that video. In 1975, an obscure and radical writer, E.F. Schumacher, wrote a book called Small is Beautiful to counter what he called the rise of giganticism. Like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, it was a classic text posing questions to people of a generation about the choices they were making, concerned about the growing focus on larger and larger economies. Fritz, as he was known to his friends, was interested in reclaiming our connections to each other and to our local areas. Any intelligent fool can make things bigger, more complex, and more violent, he wrote. It takes a genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. Since his death, some might argue that the world has grown smaller only because we've all crammed so much more into it, right? More people, more things, and an economy that is fueled completely on the idea of growth. In other words, fueled on the large. When I purchased a used copy of Small is Beautiful back in the mid-'80s, we couldn't conceive of how many things we would be owning just a couple decades later, owning and trading and then discarding and then shipping all over the world. And many of the consequences that Fritz Schumacher predicted have come true, including record occurrences of mental health issues among people, a lack of a sense of purpose among workers, which we see more and more in the questions that people are asking about why people aren't going back to the jobs that we need, but which brought them little satisfaction, in which they felt as if they were being treated just like parts of a machine. This is an economy that some might say now might literally be the death of us and our planet. But I get ahead of myself. I look forward every year to the challenge of the Bid for Love sermon. I hope some of you are out there scheming. It's only a couple weeks before you get a chance to bid on it for next year. And it occurs at our annual services auction, as was said earlier, and it'll occur this year on Saturday, November 6th. If you're new to our community, this is where we donate the skills we have and others bid on those, and it's a very important part of our budget. My skills being somewhat limited, I offer the chance to pick a topic for what I'm pretty good at doing, which is standing up here and talking about things that need to be talked about. And there's several people out there that have purchased this in the past, and it's always a wonderful service. Gives us the opportunity to use small animals and have small instruments like ukuleles in our service, right? So that's the theme, in case you didn't have that cup of coffee this morning, which I somehow missed and didn't get the connection. What do a van, a tiny house, and a backpack have in common? Well, all of them are ways that Peggy Kroll, our winning bidder from last year, has sought to remind herself of what is important. When we had lunch, which is, by the way, part of the Bid for Love sermon, item 2, it's a treat for me as well, Peggy told me that she was one of 6 who grew up in very small houses in Oakland, 1- and 2-bedroom houses. She never had her own bedroom, and the largest house she ever owned in her life was under 1,400 square feet, in which she raised her children. Living with the basics appeals to her, and she likes the way that her vacations focus her down, as she puts it. Not surprising that our Justice Council convener would have this orientation. Peggy knows that small is beautiful, as you can see from these slides from her van and her life. She said that she would allow her children to bring a friend when they camped, which is how she ended up with 6 children in the van when they were growing up. And as the residents of the new Youth Empowerment Tiny House Project Village near the Oakland Airport know, this small really is beautiful. This is a youth-initiated effort that brought tiny homes, and you will remember 2 of them sat for the longest time in our upper parking lot because the project was delayed by the pandemic. For some of these young people, it is the first home they have had off the street in years and years. One of the new residents is now in his 20s, and said that he has lived on the streets of Oakland almost exclusively since he was 11. There's also another small tiny house village that I see every week when I go to spend time with my precious grandchild, because there are people who took a lot that had been empty for decades and decided to build houses for families on it. Those houses now have solar panels and brightly painted murals like the ones on the houses that lived in our parking lot, and they are completely unauthorized as well. What a contrast to the norms of this nation are these tiny houses. Because you see, the United States, along with Canada and Australia, leads the world in terms of the size of our houses. It's interesting, right? All those former British colonizers, somehow. It's probably worth some speculation. In this nation, however, it is also matched by the size of our vehicles. Trucks and SUVs continue to be the most common vehicles that are owned in this nation. And these are vehicles which would never fit into the streets of Europe, which is one big change. And yet, as I learned last summer, weaving my way across the nation in my dog-filled van, one's spirit, as Peggy says, can settle down when the items are few and the routine is simple. Small is beautiful. And that includes the small actions that we can take to build understanding. The Dalai Lama has made climate change a priority for his spiritual leadership. Peggy shared some of his words earlier. He has especially stressed the need to embrace one another as human beings and as part of a human family as we face this time of climate change. For else, he fears, it will be a time when the divisions among us grow larger. He has especially stressed that we can treat one another with compassion. He writes, "We need a revolution of compassion based on a warm-heartedness that will contribute to a more compassionate world with a sense of the oneness of humanity. The entire human family must unite to protect our common home." Small is beautiful. And yet many now scoff at the earnestness of those who recycle and think it's enough, especially because we know that the vast majority of our recycling now, unfortunately, is actually discarded for being contaminated and not clean enough. Though recycling is a small act, it's a good choice. It doesn't solve the problem, but perhaps it might, by recycling, remind you of the packaging that you buy, and so you buy different things. Perhaps it might remind you about what you eat, and so you buy things that you eat that are lower on the carbon footprint. Perhaps that might remind you of the huge contribution to the carbon footprint of global travel, and perhaps you might reduce your number of trips by 1 a year. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, space heating and air conditioning, though, is one of the largest contributors to the carbon footprint. And that, of course, is because we're heating and cooling these enormous houses. And that means more carbon in the atmosphere. The supersizing of our abodes does not bode well. There's another reason for us to remember that small is beautiful, and that is because we have a housing crisis in our nation, and it is beyond a crisis in our area, as we all know. It is both a general crisis and also generational. One of the sadnesses for me during these last couple years has been the way that people have quietly informed me that they are having to leave the area because they can no longer afford housing. Now, people leave the area for many reasons, but for many that is definitely a factor. It's what gets them thinking about it. And during the pandemic, more and more people just made that decision, that what was important to them was to be somewhere else where they could actually afford a little bit more space. We have a zoning that restricts or forbids tiny houses in many places, and that's something I think we need to think about. Zoning may actually be a relic from another time and something we need to radically rethink. Would tiny houses, for example, be a possibility for the growing number of California college students and working people who live in their cars? Some by choice, but others because they have no other alternative. Others live in tents in the living room of apartments made for 3 or 4 people, which these days may house 7 or more. Thinking smaller in terms of housing would be a radical change. And what will we as a nation decide? We have, again, one of the largest sizes of houses in the world. And it's important to think about how we continue, whether it's about the size of our houses or that thing that we buy at Target that we're likely to throw away in a few months. The issue of waste and using and consuming things that we don't actually need in a right sizing of our lives is something we need to think about. There was a chilling clip released a few weeks ago on the international news that shows the literal mountains of used clothing exported from the United States that now can no longer be recycled into insulation and other products that they used to be because the fast fashion industry is designing them out of such shoddy materials that they disintegrate after just a few months and cannot be reused even for these other uses. So reemerging after the pandemic, we have much to think about what we really want and what we really need and what we truly, truly value. Is it a new outfit for every season in every week of the year, or is it to ensure that our children and our grandchildren will have an environment that sustains them and their children? I think the ghost of Fritz Schumacher, whose economics asked us to think about returning to a human scale, is something we truly need to embrace. And we need to think about how we do that here as a community as well. Perhaps this is the time when we realize that small really is beautiful. Maybe small, maybe smaller, maybe small-ish, but what is it that we can do to help contribute to this? It's important. Small changes might make it happen. I want to say that if you are not aware of the generational Gen Z activists around us, you should learn their names. You should follow their words. You should pay attention to what they're saying. In fact, right now, 21 of them from this nation, and they are an international community, much more connected than many of the rest of us. 21 of them, though, in this nation are suing our United States government for our failure to act on climate-related policy to date. They're saying we've waited too long, and it's beyond the time to adopt small things. They're asking for big change now. Because that's the thing, and here's the paradox. Small is beautiful, and this is where we get to hold those two truths in tension. We need to make those necessary small changes that we each can make, and we also need to be working for the larger changes that we have to make as a society as our time is running out. In Schumacher's day, environmentalists used to talk about how we had some decades to go. Now they're talking about years to make changes that we truly need to make. And just this week, President Biden's climate change agenda became a political football, getting tossed back and out, and looks like being sidelined because of the changes and divisions among us. It is long past time to act. Vic Barrett is a 22-year-old climate activist who has tattooed the number 370 on his arm, and he did this at a global climate change conference. He says, the 370 in the tattoo refers to a measurement in parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This was the level it was at when he was born in 1999. It's now more than 400 parts, which most scientists agree is a hazardous indication of human-made climate change. This is what Barrett says. The tattoo is a reminder to myself and to others that there are generations of young people who have been born into a world that we know is scientifically incapable of sustaining them. It's highlighting this unique experience of being a young person on this planet right now. Swedish climate and environmental activist Greta Thunberg denounced the world's so-called leaders last month at a speech at Italy's Youth for Climate Summit, accusing politicians of failing to act on climate change and describing their promises as 30 years of blah, blah, blah. In an impassioned speech on the podium, the 18-year-old Thunberg said that despite countries around the world vowing to meet ambitious targets, the climate crisis was continuing to escalate. Build back better, blah, 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 she said, referring to the words of President Biden and Prime Minister Boris Johnson in particular. The time has come to listen and to act. So let's take a breath, because small is beautiful, and there are things that we can do. And the small can inspire us to take the risks and make the bigger changes we need to make. What if all congregations in Contra Costa County were entitled to build, say, 3, or if you want to be Unitarian, even 1 tiny house on their property, if each one was allowed to do that? How would that at least provide a place for some of the people who now have no place? What if we continue our efforts here to think about how we reduce our dependence on fossil fuels? What if we think about how we install that electric charging station that some of us have been asking for? What if we look at the ways we can simplify what we're doing? I know that the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association is looking at whether or not we will ever return to in-person conferences, wondering if the carbon footprint is worth it for this kind of travel. What if almost every one of us in this congregation vowed to learn about what a small group of us has been working so hard on for the last year, which is the Walnut Creek Sustainability Week? Our Climate Action Committee, under the leadership of our member, Bob Joe, has designed this and is sponsoring this from October 24th to October 30th. I know that every one of us could volunteer, could show up for one of the many events that are being offered. I know I'm excited about leading conversations about climate despair here on the Wednesday night of that week. And I'm nervously excited about being the marshal of the bike parade on the last day. I actually haven't been on my bike in a while, so I'm going to have to do some preparation for that so I don't embarrass us. But some of you could come along and help me out in case I fall off and someone else needs to marshal the parade. The reality is this, that tiny houses make big changes in people's lives. That thinking down and allowing ourselves to connect with what is truly important to us, as we had to do over the last 2 years, and which we so easily are starting to forget now, makes a difference. And that our small voices united can send a message, as our young adults and youth are asking us to do, that says that we must now make those small sacrifices that allow us the big future that we desire. I want to thank Peggy for her inspiration for this service. You can thank her too as well, because it is important for us to remember that small is beautiful and that each of us can make a difference.